Elections are the heartbeat of democracy, right? We believe that when we vote, our voices matter. But what if I told you that in the last presidential election, about 80 million Americans felt their votes didn't count? That's nearly 1 in 4 voters who think their choice was meaningless. Here's another jaw-dropper. In the 2020 US election, a mere 0.0003% of votes were found to be fraudulent. Despite that, many states pushed for stricter voting laws, claiming they were protecting democracy. But were they really? You might be surprised to learn that more than 50% of voters are often left without a representative who truly reflects their views. How does this happen? Is our system broken, or is it working exactly as intended for some? In this video, we'll explore how different voting systems, gerrymandering, and the influence of money can twist our elections. We'll dive into how media manipulation shapes our opinions and uncover the shocking truth about minority rule. Join us as we reveal why elections don't always reflect the will of the people. Get ready to see democracy in a whole new light. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Choice. How voting systems shape outcomes. We often think that in elections, the majority rules. But the truth is, the system itself can twist outcomes. Take first past the post, FPTP, for example. It's the most common voting system in the world, but it can leave millions of votes essentially wasted. Let's say candidate A gets 40% of the vote, candidate B gets 30%, and candidate C gets 30%. Candidate A wins, even though 60% of voters didn't want them. Does that seem fair? Probably not. In contrast, ranked choice voting, RCV, offers a solution. Instead of choosing one candidate, you rank them in order of preference. This way, if your top pick doesn't have enough support, your vote still counts for your second choice. Cities like San Francisco and New York have switched to RCV, and data shows that 61% of voters felt more represented after the switch. But even RCV isn't perfect. Some studies show that it can be confusing, especially for first-time voters. This brings up an interesting fact: in some elections, up to 15% of ballots can be thrown out because voters didn't follow the instructions correctly. So, voting systems matter. They shape who wins, who loses, and how people feel about the outcome. The bottom line? Even when we feel we're given a choice, it's the system that often decides the winner, sometimes in ways we don't fully understand. Chapter 2: Gerrymandering, the silent manipulator of democracy. Gerrymandering is one of those words you might have heard, but don't fully know what it means. It's a practice where politicians redraw voting district lines to make sure they win, even if most people in the area don't agree with them. This sneaky trick has been around for centuries. In fact, the term comes from 1812 when Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry signed a law creating a district that looked like a salamander. Here's where it gets crazy. A study in 2019 showed that 79% of congressional seats in the US were considered safe due to gerrymandering. That means many elections are basically decided before anyone even votes. And it's not just the US. Gerrymandering happens worldwide. In India, for example, certain regions are redrawn to favor particular ethnic groups or political parties. This creates false majorities that distort true public opinion. Here's a fun fact: both parties do it, and both complain about it when the other side is in charge. It's like a game where the rules change depending on who's holding the pencil. In 2018, the US Supreme Court ruled that federal courts couldn't solve partisan gerrymandering issues, leaving the problem in the hands of the very people who benefit from it. The strategy is simple: divide opposition voters, or pack them all into a few districts. This way, they don't pose a real threat. It's sneaky, it's manipulative, and it's legal. This manipulation creates a system where some voices are amplified, while others are drowned out, leaving elections far from reflective of the people's will. Chapter 3: Voter Suppression. When democracy isn't for everyone. When we think of voter suppression, we often picture something from the distant past. But it's not just a historical issue. Voter suppression is alive and well in modern democracies. It comes in many forms, from strict voter ID laws to purging voter rolls. Take the US as an example. After the 2013 Supreme Court ruling in Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, states rushed to pass laws that made it harder to vote. In fact, 25 states have passed restrictive voting laws in the last decade. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, nearly 17 million Americans were removed from voter rolls between 2016 and 2018 alone. One of the most shocking forms of voter suppression is polling place closures. Research shows that after Shelby, nearly 1,700 polling places were closed, disproportionately affecting minority communities. Imagine being forced to travel hours just to cast a vote. For some people, especially those without reliable transportation or flexible work schedules, that's enough to keep them from voting altogether. And then there's the question of voter ID laws. Proponents say these laws prevent fraud, but actual data shows that in-person voter fraud is exceedingly rare. In one study by the Brennan Center, they found only 31 cases of impersonation fraud out of 1 billion votes cast in U.S. elections from 2000 to 2014. So why do these laws exist? The strategy behind them is often to make voting harder for specific groups, particularly minorities, the poor, and the elderly, who may have a harder time getting the required IDs. It's not just about stopping fraud, it's about shaping the electorate to benefit one side. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more insights on the truth behind elections. Chapter 4: The Power of Money. Who really decides elections? Money talks, especially in politics. Elections are supposed to reflect the will of the people, but often, they reflect the will of the wealthiest donors. In the 2020 US election, a staggering $14 billion was spent on campaigns. That's more than twice the amount spent in 2016. It raises a key question: can an ordinary voter compete with billionaires and corporations in influencing outcomes? The truth is, the more money you have, the louder your voice in politics. Studies show that the top 0.01% of donors, a group of just a few thousand individuals, contribute 40% of all campaign funding in the US. What's even more shocking is that a Princeton University study found that when wealthy individuals and large corporations lobby for a particular policy, their chances of success are 45% higher than if average citizens support it. Here's a real kicker: political action committees, PACs, and super PACs allow donors to pour unlimited amounts of money into campaigns. It's perfectly legal. This dark money influences not only who gets elected but also which issues get discussed. Candidates who don't have access to big funds often find themselves sidelined. It's a clear strategy: drown out smaller voices with an avalanche of cash. So, while we might think that voting is what counts, it's often the dollars spent behind the scenes that really decide who wins. And when big donors get what they want, it can make you wonder, whose interests are being served? Chapter 5: Media and Manipulation. The echo chamber effect. In the age of social media, the way we consume political news has changed. Rather than getting a balanced view, we often find ourselves stuck in echo chambers, where we only hear opinions we already agree with. This isn't just a coincidence, it's a strategy. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter use algorithms that show you content based on your past behavior. So, if you've liked a lot of political posts from one side, guess what? You'll keep seeing more from that side. Here's a wild stat. According to a Pew Research Center study, 73% of Americans who consume political news on social media say they don't regularly see opposing viewpoints. This creates a distorted reality where each side believes they're in the majority, and the other side is either misinformed or extreme. Fake news makes things worse. In 2016, false stories were shared on Facebook more than real news from major outlets. One of the most infamous stories claimed that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. Of course, this was completely false, but it reached millions of people before it was debunked. Politicians know how to use these echo chambers to their advantage. They tailor their messages to inflame their base and stir up emotions like anger or fear. A quote from the book, The Filter Bubble, by Eli Pariser explains it well: when you don't see what the other side thinks, you become more certain you're right, and less willing to compromise. It's a strategy to keep voters loyal and energized. So, while elections are meant to reflect a range of opinions, the media we consume can warp those views, creating a divide so wide that it's hard to believe we're all watching the same events unfold. If you found this content eye-opening, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the mechanics of democracy.